Hey 20th century, this is the first video that I am recording that helps explain the Holocaust notes. Now, of course, it would be best if we could be together to do this, but unfortunately we cannot. So I'm going to separate my first bit of information into two videos. So the first video is going to be about the beginnings of the Holocaust. I will be reading a lot from my notes and maybe adding a little bit here and there as I go along. So here we go. So the Holocaust was an event that occurred from 1933 until 1945. Those are the years that correspond to the Nazi Party being in charge of Germany. So the notes begin this way with the definition of the Holocaust. It says, the Holocaust was the state-sponsored, and that means German government organized, systematic persecution and annihilation, so it's widespread mistreatment and annihilation, of Europe's Jewish population by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Well, the Holocaust was such a huge event. Nearly 12 million people were killed as a result. The Nazis needed helpers. Those helpers would be collaborators. People in every country that the Nazi and German army took over, they were willing to help the Nazis carry out the Holocaust. Jews were the primary victims, but they were not the only ones. Gypsies, handicapped people, Polish people were also killed as a result of the Holocaust. Jehovah's Witnesses, a religious group, prisoners of war from the Soviet Union and their soldiers were also victims. Political opponents of the Nazi Party, criminals in jail, and also homosexuals were also victims of the Nazis. Well, the Holocaust begins January 30th, 1930, when Adolf Hitler becomes chancellor. To make it so that his opponents are not a problem, we remember that Adolf Hitler created a new jail system, and that new jail system was the concentration camp system. It's that system that will be used later on to house thousands and thousands and millions of people. The first concentration camp began in 1933 and was at a place called Dachau. This concentration camp was for political opponents of the Nazis, namely Communist political party. And from 1933 to 1936, the concentration camp system held political opponents and Jehovah's Witnesses. You do not see Jewish people large scale go into the camp system in the first few years of the Nazis' reign. Well, the next part of the notes is about why or how could the Holocaust occur. Let me say this first off. I will give you things that were going on in Europe before the Nazis took over, things that the Nazis were doing, but I really cannot explain how mass murder of upwards of 12 million people could occur. The mass murder of 12 million people is simply very hard to wrap your head around. So I don't know that I will be able to explain to you how it could happen or why it happened, but I will give you ideas that were in people's minds that would make it or could make it possible. So it says racial purity. Beliefs and actions at the center of the mass murder. There is no single cause of the Holocaust. Rather, it's a mixture of ideas, actions, and perceptions. The Holocaust and its destruction of Jews was based on history, anti-Semitism of the day, and the idea of racial warfare. In fact, the notes that I give to you all come from the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and these notes do center around Jewish people because they are the one group that is targeted for destruction. So let's start off with a little bit of the history. So I guess we could say that there had always been a historical disliking and mistreatment of Jewish people throughout the centuries in Europe. And we could say that the Nazi government played up that historical disliking and mistreatment and used people's already perceptions and beliefs about Jewish people to their benefit to where they could mistreat and mass murder nearly 6 million Jewish people. So let's start off with the history section. It says the early Christian church viewed Jews as the killer of Christ. As a result of this, the anti-Jewish feeling would very much grow in Europe in the Roman times all the way up till the Nazis took over in 1933. I sent to you guys in an attachment some examples of anti-Jewish action that occurred well before the Nazis took over in forms of laws. There were laws throughout the centuries dating back to 306 AD that would basically put Jewish people aside, make them feel less than everybody else, and kind of set the stage for the idea that it is acceptable to mistreat Jewish people. There were hostile actions towards Jewish people during the Middle Ages and during the Protestant Reformation. Hostile actions and beliefs were common. Physical violence towards Jewish people was common in Europe well before the Nazis took over, and even Jews were limited on what businesses they were allowed to start, and they were generally not allowed to own property. So they were definitely being put aside and being put down as not equal to anybody else. So the ideas were starting to flow and get into the minds of non-Jewish people that Jewish people are not as good as everybody else. Early policies in Europe regarding Jews focused first on their conversion to Christianity. So many communities wanted to force Jews to take up Christianity, and if that didn't work, the Jews were expelled from their communities. So again, this history of mistreatment. It finally says here, occupations involving money stirred up jealousies and misconceptions about Jewish people. These misconceptions would be that Jewish people were all economically successful and that Jewish people would be able to control the money systems in regions of Europe. Well, that is true to some extent, but not true mainly. There were successful Jewish people in business. There were successful people in banking that were Jewish people. But there were just as many Jewish people that were not very successful and would have been lower class people based on the amount of money they had. Just because you're Jewish does not mean that you are automatically going to be successful. Jews were successful and they were unsuccessful, just like everybody else. But once people in Europe begin to have a perception that Jewish people live a certain way or act a certain way, those perceptions are awfully difficult to break. And we've heard of the idea that perception is reality. And so in Europe, there was definitely a perception or belief that Jewish people were a certain way and did certain things, even though by and large that was not true. But all it takes is people to believe misconceptions or falsehoods, and that's all it takes. That's going to be the end of this first video.